Today, I would like to talk about the process of migration and how this large, deep canyon immediately north of Flagstaff here, the Grand Canyon, affects the migration process. So today, we'll look at a number of topics. First, try to define what migration is, try to figure out which species we're going to be talking about. Then try to get at the question of how Grand Canyon as a landform affects migration. And we'll talk a little bit about how humans have affected migration in this landscape as well, and some of the conservation issues. First, I'm the Curator of Biology at the Museum of Northern Arizona. I am one in a long string of people who have worked here. Some of these folks were geniuses, and some of them, of course, they're still with us, and they still are geniuses. But Walter McDougall, long-term botanist for the Colorado Plateau, worked here for many, many years and assembled information on the distribution of plant life. Eddie McKee, first naturalist for Grand Canyon National Park back in the late 1920s and 1930s, went on to a just incredible career in geology with the U.S. Geological Survey. And Stephen Carruthers, a mentor of mine and a wonderful friend, is actually one of the prominent architects of management of the Colorado River in Grand Canyon. And he conducted the first ecological inventory down there in 1976, which I was fortunate enough to participate in. So the Museum of Northern Arizona has a long history of biological research in Grand Canyon, trying to understand its ecology, its species, and how they're distributed and how they're changing through time. Now, so we're talking about Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is kind of in the middle of the Colorado River's course from the Wind Rivers in Wyoming and the Rocky Mountains in Colorado down through Utah into the northern Arizona region here. And then from there, the river course flows south and into the Sea of Cortez. So Grand Canyon lies about in the middle of the basin, and the overall drainage that comes into Grand Canyon is shown in kind of a red and white chain style there. We call it the Grand Canyon ecoregion. This is a landscape that incredibly splendid to view from the rim. From the rim, there's no view that gives you more than about 5% view of the entire landscape. It's such a big landscape that it's just impossible to really to see it all in one eye unless you're very far out in outer space. But it's also a landscape of change. I think many people come to the rim and are struck by how stable it looks. But really, this is a landscape that has been changing continuously through recent geologic time. Last 60 million years, the landscape has begun to develop. During Miocene times, 15 million years ago, the landscape began to look like we see it now. And that time period is the origin of a lot of our biota that we have in the landscape now. During Pliocene times, 4 or 5 million years ago, the region dried out more seriously than it is now. 2.5 million years ago, South America bumped into North America, causing what's called the Great Faunal Interchange between the two continents. Recently, in geologic time, over the last several 100,000 years, we've had massive lava flows that have poured into Grand Canyon, creating Pleistocene dams and lakes, large lakes, in a changing climate that was much cooler and wetter back in those days. But beginning about 12,500 years ago, the landscape once again began to dry out. We lost a lot of big critters in the landscape, and then, of course, humans stepped in and have been altering it in one way or another for the last 12,000 years or so, at least. So now, the Grand Canyon region is it's a kind of a grand meeting place. It's what ecologists call an ecotone, and this is really a mega ecotone. The Mogollon Rim is the southern border of the Colorado Plateau, and it abuts kind of a long diagonal strike through Arizona with the Basin and Range geologic province off to the south and to the west. So we have here 4 biomes: Rocky Mountain, the Intermountain, Cordilleran, Madeiran, and Mojave-Sonoran biomes here. 4 major life zones that have a lot of their own unique creatures. Again, it's the intersection of 2 geologic provinces, 3.5 kilometers of elevation change across the landscape. So it's really a macro ecotone of biodiversity with about 2,500 plant species, more than 500 vertebrate species, and perhaps 20 to 50,000 macroinvertebrate species. Jumping back to the topic then of what we're talking about today, migration. Migration is a spatial and sometimes temporal dispersal behavior that enhances reproductive success. What I mean by that is that there's a reason that things migrate. They may not know it because a lot of it's genetically controlled, but they're moving to an environment where they can enhance their reproductive success by surviving harsh conditions and then returning to a productive landscape, as birds do in leaving the cold winter environment here in northern Arizona and heading into Mexico. But there are several kind of forms of migration. But the key elements of migration, as opposed to simple kind of random movement, is that the movement is often linear. The organism takes up a path and goes for it. Sometimes if you look in the sand down on the floor of Grand Canyon, you'll see that an antlion has left its little conical burrow in the sand and just taken off in a direction. But the direction is fairly uniform. They're trying to get to greener pastures. And the migration may involve part or all of a population. It's often non-random in its direction, but it generally takes the organism out of its home range. And therefore, the organism in traveling begins to ignore some of the primary stimuli that it normally responds to in the home range, such as kind of the reproductive urge and feeding behaviors are altered and whatnot. So the animals, the organism is using different behaviors and different ways of using energy during migration. Biologists have long struggled with really clarifying the types of migration, but certainly there is good evidence of strongly seasonal migration, what we call eruptive migration, which is some organism goes through an incredible outbreak, say the plague locust of Africa, and they move out into the landscape, so it's an eruption. We had a locust here in North America that back in the 19th century caused great damage on the Great Plains, and it turns out that was an eruptive emergence out of the Rocky Mountains that took that locust all the way across the Great Plains. Melanopolis spretus was that critter's name, the Rocky Mountain locust. Completely gone now. It's actually extinct, but that was an key example of an eruptive migration here in North America. Then there is reproduction-specific movements. I put the words in there: semilparous, meaning single reproductive event, or iteroparous. Think of a salmon as being a semilparous reproductive-specific migration, coming up into a river system, spawning and dying, versus, say, fish in freshwaters that often are doing the same spawning run year after year. So seasonal, eruptive, reproductive, nomadic means there may not be an endpoint or a destination for that migrant. They may not know exactly where they're going. They just know that they got to get out of this place. And then there can be combinations of all the above. For example, we have cyclical migration that goes on a daily basis, say with some amphipods and with toads and things like that. So there can be kind of alterations of any of these types in our definitions of migration. Okay, so what kinds of organisms migrate? Plants migrate? Well, plants can actually shift their position in space, and they do so in response to things like flooding, for example, clonal plants, for example. There are also many species that are pollinated and move their seeds via the wind, and therefore they remain in these river corridors, like the Colorado River corridor and Grand Canyon, by passive up canyon wind dispersal of their seeds. Now, is that migration? It's a life cycle based, it can be annual depending on the plants, but that is certainly directional movement, and it's a movement that keeps them in the riparian habitats that they need to be in. Otherwise, those species wouldn't occur in river systems. They've got a movement pattern that allows them to persist in their landscape. There are also kind of big multi-generational movements of plants. I'll talk about that in relation to climate change in a bit. So plants can migrate. Invertebrates, many invertebrates migrate. We don't know very much about many of their stories. Several dragonfly species in our region, aquatic true bugs, beetles, and butterflies are examples of macroinvertebrates that very commonly migrate. Think of the monarch butterfly, for example. And then many smaller insects like aphids, when they emerge in the wing form this time of year, they disperse as aerial drift, kind of acting very much like the seeds of the plants we're talking about just now, being dispersed upstream and therefore being able to remain in this case, in the river corridor that they require habitat in. And then among vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals all have examples of migration here in northern Arizona. And so let's talk about plants first a little bit. And just as an example, Phragmites, it's called common reed, is a very abundant native species here in Grand Canyon. There is a non-native variety that's invading into Utah. It's quite a concern for it if it comes into our region. But the native Phragmites, common reed, is a well-established plant. It takes advantage of river shoreline environments and wetland environments. It has running roots, so it creates a clone. Now, the plant lives in pretty wild settings in some places, in say tributaries that are not dammed. The tributaries flood, and a big portion of the clone might get wiped out. But then the plant can restart and grow back into the environment, perhaps from a different place, perhaps in a different location, perhaps the channel has changed and it's moving into a different configuration in the channel. But nonetheless, it's a good example of an individual plant being able to modify its distribution in relation to environmental conditions. So that's a great example, I think. Coyote well is another plant that falls into this kind of category. So in the longer term, we know from C. Hart Merriam's work in the 1890s that, and we all look up at the peaks now for the turning of the aspen leaves and see these life zones. We can see all the way to the top of the peaks where there's alpine vegetation, no trees up there, coming down all the way through the Verde Valley with desert scrub vegetation in the lower Sonoran Desert. So these life zones, interestingly, have not been stable necessarily over time. And we learned a lot about them by looking at the poop of various organisms left in caves and in middens. Shasta ground sloth remains in Rampart Cave down in the Western Grand Canyon, packrat middens all over the landscape. In both cases, we can look at the plants that these animals were eating and learn what the vegetation was like right outside their dens. And what that's shown is that these life zones that we have here now were 3,000 feet lower in elevation just 12,000 years ago. So these are very long-term changes. It's a movement of entire vegetation types in response to climate change. And that process is still going on as humans are continuing to really alter the climate. However, we get a lot of our information from poop, and that's kind of a great story to be able to talk to kids about, especially. Poop is really fun. Okay, let's move on to migration among invertebrates. Now, some of you, if you've been out walking this time of year, you might see kind of smallish tarantulas walking across the landscape. Phainopelma calcoides is one of our more common northern Arizona tarantulas. This is one of 3 species. We've got an endemic one, very poorly known in the Flora Grand Canyon, but the males live only for about 3 years. And so they emerge, they grow up, they wander out into the landscape trying to find a female. They don't have much time to breed compared to the females, which live for 20 years. So the females are in their burrows typically, and somehow the two connect. How they manage to bump into each other is quite a mystery, but nonetheless they're able to connect, and the females only have to breed once to be able to produce eggs for 20 years. So they have an advantage over other life forms in that. Don't have to put up with boys too often. They're fairly abundant here, but the females are quite difficult to see. But nonetheless, in the fall months, the males are migrating, kind of nomadically, to try to find females in a reproductive migration. We have quite a few species of millipedes here in northern Arizona, and these respond to summer rains. The monsoons may flood their burrows, and the millipedes have to come out and move, and during that time they mate. Desert millipedes are also migrating, oftentimes in a kind of a reproduction or nomadic fashion. When it comes to dragonflies, we have a rich biodiversity here. We just got a book out on the dragonflies and damselflies of the Grand Canyon region. If anybody's interested in that, just get a hold of me and we'll get you a copy. But in that, we identify about 90 species of dragonflies in the area, including a couple of rare things. And these dragonflies, not all of them are migratory. Only about 10% of them are considered to be migratory. However, they make make for some pretty remarkable storytelling. The genus Pantala, or the gliders, are the two world record holders for migrations. The wandering glider, Pantala flavescens, has been observed at elevations of above 18,000 feet, going over the Himalayas. It's the most widely distributed dragonfly in the world. We've got Pantala flavescens in Hawaii, on Easter Island. These are some of these dragonflies may be flying across some of the oceans in terms of their distribution. The spot-wing glider, in contrast, is more of a north-south migrant here in North America, but these are two of the most widely migrating dragonflies on Earth. They're a little bit too small to put radio transmitters on. We get that kind of information by looking at green darners on the left there, Anax junius, and these have been radio tracked for 1,100 kilometers. So they move really widely. And again, the south migration is where they're best known. We have other migrant dragonflies, including black saddlebags shown here. It's congener of the red saddlebag, Tremulanusta, and then several smaller dragonflies that are well known to do migration. So perhaps 10–12% of our dragonflies here in northern Arizona are migrants. There have been migrant flights that darkened the skies of Tucson by Pantala, for example. And Pantala is really interesting because they arrive right on the summer solstice. Pretty much the 21st of June is when I generally first see them flying around. I assume they're breeding, but coming up to breed, but they fly up from Mexico, arriving here on the 21st of June. So look for those at the height of the summer light. Great photos here by Doug Danforth, who's a co-author on our Dragonfly book. Okay, some of us have heard about Mormon crickets. These are not crickets that we encounter very commonly down here in Flagstaff, but if you go up to the meadows on the north rim, DeMott Park, for example, these are super abundant in the summer. Mormon crickets can emerge in such abundance that they form fronts, and the fronts march through the landscape, eating everything in sight. You don't want to lie down in front of a approaching army of Mormon crickets, because they literally will eat you. They're incredible omnivores. They only live for 60 to 90 days as adults or so, and they generally don't migrate more than a few kilometers in a nomadic fashion. They face the issue of trying to survive in an environment where everything's trying to eat them, including themselves. They're cannibalistic. So they march in these fronts. If an individual falls behind, it gets consumed by its fellows, or if it drifts off to the side, it gets consumed by all the different predators that are in the landscape trying to feed on these things. So their whole life cycle is about moving. They have to feed and mate on the move, and their ultimate kind of fate is that they'll be consumed one way or another, either cannibalistic or by predators. So life is really brutal for Mormon crickets, but if you want to take a look at these things, go up to the North Rim, DeMott Park in the months of especially June, July. All right, I got to do a kind of an interesting analysis of what I call bug rains, where a few years back, some friends and colleagues here in Flagstaff who had low-angle green roofs reported massive numbers of insects falling on their roofs for hours at a time, and choking their gutters and stopping their rain collection systems. And turned out that we had up to 17 species of aquatic true bugs, like boatmen and back swimmers, and aquatic beetles flying around in mixed flocks. Mixed flocks of predators are not very common on Earth. There's some species of sharks that do this, and perhaps migrating warblers occasionally, but these were flocks with hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of individuals that would locate a target landscape to settle into, thinking it was water, but to their dismay, finding out it was not water, and they have no off switch. They head for these for what looks like water to them and just rain out of the sky. So kind of an exciting find. A bit difficult for the people that subject to these bug rains, but quite interesting. When the insects land on the roofs, they don't have any off mechanism. They don't understand that they should go someplace else, and so therefore they just lie there until they die. So in one house, I picked up five 5-gallon buckets of mostly still alive but struggling insects that had no clue as to what else to do. They would not fly away.
There is one question that did come in about the centipede population and whether they suffer in drier years.
The millipedes or centipedes?
It was asked about the centipedes, but answer it for either, whichever.
Okay. Many of these things are what we call fossorial. They live in the earth, in cracks in the earth or deep in the soil. And so it's very difficult to understand whether or not drought can really affect them. For example, I'm about to talk to butterflies. So the acastus patch there, the second line, fourth one from the left, is a butterfly that can delay its emergence from the pupa, from the chrysalis. And it might go for several years before it comes out of the pupa, waiting for the right conditions. So these are situations in which it's very difficult to understand what drought means to these things because they're very well protected until they're ready to come out. They won't show up. The same might be true of the millipedes. These giant desert millipedes, orthoporus, tend to come out when the soils are saturated. Otherwise, you never see them. So they're hidden away. There's so much we don't understand about some of these migrations. With butterfly migrations, a lot of people know about monarchs. The larva feed on milkweed. The larva obtains the poisons of the plant. These are compounds that are like digitalis. They're very toxic poisons. The caterpillar integrates those poisons into its integument, stores them in its integument, providing protection for the caterpillar, and then it pupates and transfers those poisons to the adults, the wings of the adults. And so therefore, monarch butterflies are very distasteful. I've tried them, they taste terrible. But also notice that they're orange and black. They're aposematically colored. We call that orange and black or yellow and black, aposematic coloration, warning predators that these guys taste bad. The red squares here are all species of butterflies in our landscape of the about 140 that we have here that are well known to be migrants. Again, it's about 10% of the butterflies might be migratory here, but 3 that are of prominent interest. Monarchs we've talked about. Painted lady butterflies do even a longer migration than monarchs and may involve more generations. Monarchs typically run for 3 or 4 generations to move north if they're coming from Mexico to get up to Canada, and then 1 generation flies back. Painted ladies might be up to 8 generations depending on the landscape. In Europe, there are 8 generations. Out here, there might be 4 or 5 generations. The larvae feed on thistles and other things, so it's also called the thistle butterfly. And they are progressively moving northward in wet years, not in dry years. Again, there may be some delayed eclosure capability with these. And then the butterflies, unlike monarchs, these are breeding, unlike many butterflies that migrate, these are breeding all the time that they're moving. So they're laying eggs as they go all through the landscape, multiple generations moving north, and then 1 generation flying south, but they fly at high elevation coming back. Again, can be 10,000 feet or more, 8,000 to 10,000 feet in Europe. It's been documented, and so they're rarely seen on their return migration. But they can move up to 11, a very very large number of kilometers or miles in Europe, and in North America, less clear as to certainly they're moving from Mexico to Canada, but this is a very widespread species. It could be moving even more than that. We don't really know that. American snout butterflies, kind of a subtle little thing. There's a great migration of them going on right now. This will be the last day because it's supposed to freeze hard tonight. But like the painted ladies, these tend to be eruptive in their migration. And these larvae feed on hackberry, which is more common at middle and lower elevations here. But they may fly all the way south to Argentina. We don't really know how far they go. They occur there. Their migration is tremendous and very, very poorly known. All three of these species are widely recognized by Lepidopterist. The monarch is threatened. It's now regarded as not federally listed, but there's a lot of concern for it because the return populations are getting smaller and smaller. More than 90% of the population has declined in California, for example. The Arizona population of monarchs can go either to California or to Mexico. My sense is in Grand Canyon, those that are following the river are probably headed to California, but documenting that is quite a challenge, of course. All right, now we're going to jump into the vertebrate world and look at fish. We had here in Arizona, northern Arizona, one of the most tremendous fish migrations of anywhere in the world. The Colorado pike minnow, the third one down on the left side there, which is now extirpated from Grand Canyon, a minnow species that grew to almost 5 feet in length, 60 pounds in mass, would migrate probably annually from the lower Colorado River Basin through Grand Canyon up into the upper basin to spawn and then return again. So this is a reproductive migration that is cyclical, what we would call iteroperative, occurring multiple times. The fish in the Columbia system in the same genus do these spawning runs perhaps 15 to 17 times in their lifespan. So that was a huge migration system that we don't get to witness because of the dams that have been put on the Colorado River blocking the passage of this fish. Other minnow species, the humpback chub on the top on the right side, the speckled dace on the bottom there, also undergo reproductive migrations. In the case of humpback chub, it's a regular return to the Little Colorado River to spawn for the population that's in the middle of Grand Canyon. They do that beginning in April, wrap up their spawning by about end of June. The larvae drift into the river. And those that survive will come back after several years of growth in the river. Speckled dace every year leave the tributaries because the water gets too cold for them, move into the mainstream for the winter, and then come back out into the tributaries during the summer months. So a very regular seasonal migration for them. So again, humpback chub, speckled dace, and Colorado pike minnow. I've put them into approximate relational size here to see the difference in size in these three species. They're all in the family Cyprinidae, the minnows. Okay, stepping out of the water, or kind of somewhat out of the water, into the world of amphibians. We have 3 species of amphibians now left in the Colorado River corridor, 4 if you include the probably introduced tiger salamanders that are in the upper, in the Glen Canyon reach. The bufo anaxyrus toads, 2 species, woodhouses and red spotted. Rocky Mountain is also called woodhouses. Those that are in the river corridor do a daily migration during the summer months. They'll roost up in the upper riparian zone and then hop down to the river to feed, but then jump back up at night. And this is a behavior that's probably developed over the last couple million years of trying to live in this extremely erratic river system where it couldn't be guaranteed that they wouldn't be hit by a flood any time. So if they rest up in the upper zone and then hop down to feed, they can hopefully escape and get back up to the upper zone if they did get captured by a flood or hit by a flood. The white racing stripe is a diagnostic feature for that Rocky Mountain woodhouses toad. This is a picture taken by Barry Adams from Marble Canyon of the last remaining leopard frog in the Colorado River corridor. Probably what we called then Rana yavapayensis, now Thebades is the genus. These guys in their normal habitats will leave the wetlands that they're in during the fall months and go off into the uplands to overwinter. So it's a migration, again, based on trying to survive erratic winter events. So, but an annual migration, quite different than the toads. All right, rattlesnakes, other snakes. Both of these gopher snakes and Grand Canyon pink rattlesnakes are two of about 25 species of snakes in our environment here. Both of them are likely to den up in the winter or to migrate to a wintering habitat. It's been reported for these species, but it has not yet been documented, just to my knowledge, in Grand Canyon. So keep looking for dens of Grand Canyon pink rattlesnakes, but haven't found any yet. But they could well do a seasonal migration. So birds are where we most think about migration. I'll talk about three groups of birds here, just kind of your songbirds, and then about raptors and about water birds. Got a large fauna. About 1/3 of North America's bird fauna has been detected in the Grand Canyon area. Brian Brown in his book and Gatlin's book in 2013 document the species that we have here. The seasonal migrations are the norm. These are oftentimes neotropical, about 30 species of neotropical migrant species that come up from Mexico in the tropics and breed in the Colorado River corridor, and then head back south in the winter. The spring migration is pretty dramatic. The birds are all hyped up and singing pretty actively, so we get to hear them as they're migrating. In contrast, this time of year, the fall migration is quite quiet. The warblers are dull colored. They're moving south. They're just doing kind of stopover habitat in our riparian habitats to feed a little bit and move on, but a lot of kind of quiet movement in the fall here. It's a pretty diffuse fall migration. There can be a lot of mortality in these migrations. Not unusual, particularly if October is rainy and cold, that the migrants can't find enough food in their stopover habitat and they starve to death. So it's quite common to see a lot of mortality this time of year. Single best birding place that I can think of you might be interested in if you're a birder is to go up to Cliff Spring on the North Rim. It's a very isolated spring, so all the birds in the landscape come into water there, and going in there in June is a pretty rich experience for birding. Water birds, we've got about 62 species documented in Grand Canyon so far, separated into these various guilds of waders and raptors and divers and kingfishers and dabblers and shorebirds. These are, they migrate seasonally. Migration is typically April and October. And then there's a big wintering population, particularly for waterfowl. Relatively few of these species actually nest in the river corridor. Mallards, great blue herons, common mergansers, now double-crested cormorants, spotted sandpipers. Just recently, Canada goose and osprey have also begun to breed in the river corridor. But of the 62 species, that's only a kind of small handful that actually hangs around and to breed. Most of our species show up in the winter, beginning early November and ending about the middle of March. One of the greatest places to view waterfowl is to go up to the launch ramp at Lee's Ferry and just get out your spotting scope and look across the river there. I've seen as many as 24 different species of water birds there at once. So it's quite a great place to be birding. Well, so the river, of course, is affected by Glen Canyon Dam, and it's a dam with many trade-offs associated with it. Wiped out Glen Canyon, which that process actually inspired modern American environmentalism. Downstream flow regulation had pretty dramatic effects. No big floods, loss of the sediment transport of the river, meaning clear water, and cold constant temperatures. So stable conditions that favored wetland development along the river and simplified the ecosystem quite a bit, increased the predictability of resources. And at the bottom there, we can see this greatly enhanced our water bird population. Documented this in a paper. Again, if anybody's interested in reading any of this stuff, happy to share those with you. But those elements led to the colonization of the river corridor by peregrine falcons. Right now, we have the largest breeding population of peregrine falcons in any land management unit in the 48 states. Peregrines arrive in late March, early April, depart in late summer, mid to late summer. Most of their prey are water birds that are attracted to the river in the post-dam clear water conditions there. So here's a top predator that has moved into the ecosystem, taking advantage of the novel conditions there. Other raptors that we're concerned with in the landscape have to do with our hawks and owls, and we've got about 20 species overall, 2 eagles, about 10 or 12 hawks, 8 owl species. And all of these, except probably except for great horned owls, are migratory. I hear great horns calling all winter, so I assume that they're on territory pretty much full time. The spring hawk migration and owl migrations are quite inconspicuous. It's very, occasionally you see a single hawk coming through, but it's not very dramatic, except for perhaps turkey vultures, which arrive on about the 15th of March or so here every year. So look at mid-March to see if your first turkey vulture, you can breathe a sigh of relief, spring is on its way. However, the fall hawk migration across East Kaibab monocline and the Butte Fault is just tremendous. From mid-September through mid-October, you can go up to Lipan or Yaqui points and look down on a calm autumn morning. The thermals are developing, and you might see up to 10 different species of hawks rising up out of the depths of Grand Canyon. They hit the rim, you see them look around, see the San Francisco peaks, and take off to the south. Quite amazing. Bald eagles have begun concentrating in the Post-Dam River. Ninth week, we had 29 individuals at once there with Brian Brown. We got several papers out on that concentration, what they're doing there, feeding on introduced trout. But that is a concentration that is, again, a human influenced process. They're moving through the landscape, but they use the Grand Canyon as stopover habitat. There is likely a massive raptor migration along the Hurricane Cliffs and the Grand Washout in western Grand Canyon. However, it's just not been studied yet. There may be a wonderful story to be told out there. With eagles, we're concerned with the status of golden eagle. Both golden and bald eagles migrate in and across Grand Canyon. Of course, golden eagles do breed here in the landscape as well. But when we begin to look at the migratory data, Hawkwatch has been doing a lot of long-term examination of the landscape there in Grand Canyon, around Lipan Point and the Yaqui Point. And what they've reported over the last 20 years or so is relatively stable bald eagle population. That's good news, but strongly declining golden eagle population. This is going to probably rise to the level of a serious issue here for the Fish and Wildlife Service before too long. Okay, and lastly, among the raptors, the California condor, brought back from extinction, is now undergoing its own kind of migration, moving from northern Arizona up into southern Utah in the summer months, and then coming back to northern Arizona in the winter. Great place to see these is the bridge at Marble Canyon this time of year. So you want to see some of these incredibly strange looking, wonderfully adapted birds, that's a good place to go see them. Lastly, among the mammals, we've got quite an array of migratory patterns. Bats have 4 seasonal migration stories. Not too many hibernate here in Arizona, but a couple might. There are some short distance migrators like some of the Myotis and the Western pipistrelle, and then long distance migrants, the Laziurus and free-tailed Tiderata bats. Bats also, though, can undergo daily migrations. A spotted bat radio tagged at the bottom of Grand Canyon flew up to the North Rim, a round trip flight every night for 45 miles to collect, to gather prey, probably moths mostly, to feed her young, who were probably in this location on the floor of Grand Canyon. So every day, every night, a 45-mile migratory movement for her. Ungulates like desert mule deer, well known, just a recent data on their movements. The North Kaibab deer herd moving along the Kaibab monocline. Here on the south side of San Francisco, a recent record showed a doe going back and forth 125 kilometers from the peaks to the south rim. Desert bighorn sheep engage in kind of nomadic climate-driven movement toward or away from the Colorado River, depending on how wet the year is. Rocky Mountain elk undergo quite a bit of seasonal migration, avoiding snow, as the mule deer do as well. but there have been Rocky Mountain elk seen down in around Phoenix even. So quite a bit of movement there. Among the black bears, there's seasonal dormancy, but it's not clearly migratory. Remarkable movements of mountain lions, but they seem to be within their home range of 80 to 90 miles. So not clear that any of those big carnivores are actually migrating. Okay, so we talked about all these different critters that are moving in different kind of ways. The Grand Canyon is a landform that has a couple of features that make it either suitable or a barrier to migration. The river functions as a corridor through its low elevations for things like monarchs that have to avoid freezing. So the only time they can do that this time of year is to go. The only place they can do that is the floor of the Colorado of the Grand Canyon along the Colorado River. Has not in the past been unusual to see a migrating monarch about once every minute floating by on the breeze, headed to the west. The Grand Canyon also is clearly a barrier to many species living on the north versus south rim. It provides refugial habitats of probably mostly non-migratory critters that can't actually leave the canyon. They live in refugia like caves or springs. And then there are some species that are not really affected by the landscape as a migratory in a migratory fashion. So we've got this null effect with little influence. Dragonflies, these masses of painted lady butterflies that sweep across the landscape. Many songbirds. We don't know about bats so much, but they may not be influenced by the canyon as a landform in their migration whatsoever. But lots of evidence of corridor movement, of long-term changes in plant populations, in short-term and annual fish migrations, of the movements of water birds who really prefer to stay near the water. Unlike songbirds, water birds are very much following the river, and then perhaps some mammal species as well. The Grand Canyon is certainly a barrier to nomadic invertebrates that are trying to migrate. Tarantulas and millipedes and Mormon crickets, for example, can't get across the barrier. So the refugia that exist in Grand Canyon most of the species living there, as I said, are non-migratory. So perhaps most of the species in the landscape are not really affected that much by Grand Canyon, but corridor effects are quite strong, bigger than barrier and refuge effects. So with that, we can conclude that seasonal migration is the major form of migration in the landscape, with some elements that can be shorter cycles, nightly rather, in the toads, monsoon driven by millipedes and whatnot. Eruptive emergence is something that characterizes the painted lady and snout butterfly population migrations. Reproductive specific migration, we see this in some of our wind distributed plants and fish. Nomadic population movements of anabaris, mule deer moving in relation to snowfall or upland conditions. Mountain lions, we don't really know if they're nomadically moving or not. The female that passed through Grand Canyon 4 times did it along routes that were scarcely routes to humans, but but she was able to move all the way across the canyon in just a matter of less than a day. And then there are many combinations of these above types of migrations: flood-related clonal plant movements, long-term life zone movements. The case of the Kanab amber snail, the parasite drives it out of its habitat to make it conspicuous to birds. So it's, I guess, it's working for the parasite, not for the snail so much. And then other combinations of these above types. Seasonal migrations are more common than combined forms, more common than eruptive migrations, and more common than nomadic or reproductive migrations in the landscape. But as a large, deep canyon, Grand Canyon strongly influences the local migration patterns of many of the species in its landscape. All right, so that's what I had to say about migrations. Thanks very much for your time, and please come to visit the museum sometime.